I mean, we had a fight, so I went and killed her. I mean, come on.
Do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed. If you're doing this as an interrogation, you're saying, hey, I'm a suspect. Well, now I got a problem with, so now, I mean, I
This is Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD detective, 25 years on the job.
In 2009, a Los Angeles police detective walked into an interview room, believing she was talking to investigators about a murder that had happened more than 2 decades earlier. The detectives already knew something she did not know they had. A tiny biological sample had been recovered from the victim's arm in 1986. For years, it had been almost meaningless. Then DNA technology caught up with it. The profile belonged to a woman. And when investigators secretly obtained DNA from Stephanie Lazarus, a veteran lapped detective, the profiles matched. The woman whose DNA had been found on Sherri Rasmussen's body was not a stranger. She was a police officer. She had once been involved with Sherri's husband, and now, 23 years after Sherri was killed, investigators were asking whether the woman who had spent a career investigating other people's crimes had committed one herself. But there was another question. If police had found clues pointing toward a woman connected to Sherri's husband almost immediately after the murder, why had it taken more than 2 decades to get there? Because in 1986, investigators had reached a very different conclusion. They believed Sherri Rasmussen had been killed during a burglary, and that theory would shape the investigation for years. On February 24, 1986, Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old. She lived in a condominium on Balboa Street in Van Nuys, California, with her husband, John Ruetten. Sherri was a nurse at a hospital in Glendale. That morning, Ruetten left for work at approximately 7:20. Sherri was supposed to go about her own day. Instead, she called in sick. Several hours later, people tried to reach her. Her husband called. Her sister called. Beginning at around 10 in the morning, the phone calls went unanswered. There was no response from inside the condominium. And sometime that morning, a neighbor noticed something unusual. The garage was open. There were no cars inside. At approximately 6 that evening, Ruetten returned home. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. The garage door was open. Sherri's BMW was missing. There was broken glass scattered near the driveway, apparently from the shattered sliding glass patio door. The door connecting the condominium to the garage, which Ruetten said he had closed and locked that morning, was standing ajar. Then he entered the home. Sherri was on the living room floor. She was still wearing a sleep shirt and robe. She was dead. The crime scene suggested violence. Sherri had been shot 3 times in the chest. All 3 wounds were fatal. One of the shots was a contact wound. There were injuries across her body consistent with a struggle. Her hands, mouth, face, head, and neck showed contusions, lacerations, and abrasions. There were abrasions around her wrists that investigators considered consistent with an injury involving a rope or cord. 2 pieces of broken fingernails were found near the front door. There was an injury on her face consistent with having been struck by the muzzle of a .38 caliber revolver, and near her body was a broken vase that could account for another injury to her head. But one injury would become far more important than anyone could have known that day. On Sherri's left inner forearm was what appeared to be a bite mark. The pathologist examining the body noted that the injury appeared to have occurred around the time of death. Investigators collected samples from it. Those samples would sit in evidence for years. At first, however, the investigators were looking somewhere else. Inside the condominium, some of the stereo equipment had been removed from a cabinet and stacked near the garage door. A drawer had been pulled open. Its contents were scattered on the floor. The BMW was gone. The broken patio door appeared to offer an obvious point of entry. There was a problem with that theory. There was no clear evidence of forced entry, and other valuable items inside the condominium had apparently been left untouched. Still, the initial investigators concluded that the murder had occurred during a burglary. Their theory was that one or two burglars had entered through an open door, encountered Sherri, and shot her during a struggle. It was a theory that explained the broken glass. It explained the missing car. It appeared to explain the disturbed stereo equipment, and because the suspected burglars were unknown, there was no obvious person to arrest. The case began moving in that direction. The people closest to Sherri were not necessarily at the center of the investigation, but one person did raise a possibility. Sherri's husband had previously been involved with another woman. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. And Lazarus was not simply someone from John Ruetten's past. She was a Los Angeles police officer. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus had known each other since college. Their relationship stretched across several years. They had dated and been sexually intimate. Ruetten, however, did not describe Lazarus as his girlfriend. Then, in 1984, Ruetten met Sherri. The relationship with Sherri developed. In May 1985, John and Sherri became engaged. That engagement changed something in Lazarus's life. According to evidence later presented at trial, when Lazarus learned that Ruetten was going to marry Sherri, she called him. She was upset. She cried. She asked him to come to her condominium. When he arrived, she told him she was in love with him. She asked him repeatedly to have sex with her. He did, but the encounter did not end John's relationship with Sherri. He continued seeing Sherri. They eventually moved in together, and then Lazarus confronted the woman who was going to marry him. Sherri was working at a hospital. At some point after John and Sherri began living together, Lazarus went there. She confronted Sherri. The confrontation became important years later because it established that Lazarus knew exactly who Sherri was and where she worked. That evening, Sherri returned home upset. John told her what had happened between him and Lazarus. Sherri apparently already knew about the relationship. John promised that he would have no further contact with Lazarus. In November 1985, John Ruetten and Sherri Rasmussen were married. 3 months later, Sherri was dead. There were other indications of how Lazarus had reacted to the relationship. A former roommate, Michael Hargreaves, testified that Lazarus had told him she was in love with John. At one point, she had awakened Hargreaves late at night while crying and asked him to console her. She told him that John had broken up with her and was going to marry someone else. She also told him about confronting the woman at the hospital. And Lazarus kept a journal. When investigators eventually searched her home in 2009, they recovered that journal and planners covering the period around the murder. The entries did not contain a confession. They did, however, provide a record of how intensely she had reacted to the end of her relationship with Ruetten. An April 1985 entry referred to seeing John's car, leaving a note on it, watching it for a period of time and checking on it repeatedly. In June, after learning he was getting married, Lazarus described herself as very depressed. She wrote about being unable to concentrate. In August 1985, she wrote to Ruetten's mother. She described herself as being truly in love with John and said the previous year had been emotionally difficult. None of those entries by themselves proved that Lazarus had killed Sherri. But years later, prosecutors would use them to build a picture of motive. The defense would challenge that picture, and the distinction would matter, because feeling rejected is not murder. Anger is not murder. A failed relationship is not murder. The question was whether those circumstances connected Lazarus to what happened inside Sherri's condominium on February 24, 1986. At the time, investigators did not have the answer. They did have physical evidence. The bite mark, the fingernails, the bullets, the fingerprints, the hairs, the blood, the gunshot evidence, and the BMW. But forensic technology in 1986 could not turn all of those pieces into the kind of evidence investigators would eventually have decades later. The bite mark sample was preserved, and that turned out to be critical. The sample was kept in the coroner's evidence room. For nearly 20 years, it remained frozen. Then, in December 2004, members of the Lapt Cold Case Unit reopened the case and asked the coroner's office to locate it. The old evidence had survived, and now there was a new question. Could DNA be extracted from it? In 2005, Lapt criminalist Jennifer Francis examined a portion of one of the swabs under a microscope. She found nucleated epithelial cells. Those cells can be present in saliva. And when the sample was tested, investigators discovered something that immediately changed the case. There were two DNA profiles. One was the victim's. The other was from a woman. That result did not identify the woman, but it challenged the original theory. The suspected intruders had been described as male burglars. Now, the most important biological evidence from the victim's body was pointing to a female contributor. Investigators attempted to compare the DNA profile against a national database. There was no match. The woman was still unidentified. The case remained unsolved, but the meaning of the evidence had changed. The detectives no longer had to ask only, who were the burglars? They could ask a different question. Who was the woman? And once investigators began examining the women who might have had a reason to harm Sherri, the history between Sherri, John, and Stephanie Lazarus became difficult to ignore. In February 2009, the case was reviewed again by homicide detectives. This time, investigators looked at the people in Sherri's life. Lazarus emerged as a possible suspect. But there was a problem. She was not some unknown person living on the edge of the investigation. She was a veteran Lapt detective. By then, she had spent roughly 25 years in the department. She had built a career. She had worked as a detective. She had developed a reputation within the department. And she had spent more than 2 decades living her life after Sherri's murder. If investigators were going to accuse her, they needed more than a theory. They needed a connection. They already had the DNA from the bite. Now they needed to know whether that DNA belonged to Lazarus. So they did not simply ask her for a sample. They obtained one without telling her. Investigators secretly collected a discarded drink cup and straw. A criminalist developed a DNA profile from the material. Then came the comparison. The DNA profile from the discarded drink matched the major profile from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. The case had changed again. But investigators still needed confirmation. After Lazarus was arrested, a complete DNA sample was obtained. The prosecution's forensic testing later found that Lazarus's DNA matched the major profile from the bite mark. A second expert independently tested another bite mark swab. That testing again produced 2 profiles. The minor profile was consistent with Sherri. The major profile matched Lazarus. The second examiner reported a match at all 15 tested loci. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested. The arrest took place at the Lapt's administrative building in downtown Los Angeles. The woman being arrested was not an unknown suspect who had suddenly appeared. She was one of their own. She had been a police officer when Sherri was killed. She had remained a police officer while the case sat unsolved. And now investigators were alleging that she had killed another woman's wife. But DNA was not the only thing investigators had found. There was also the gun. In 1984, Lazarus had purchased a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Model 49 revolver. It was a 5-shot handgun with an approximately 2-inch barrel. The ammunition recovered from Sherri's body was identified by prosecution experts as federal .38J+P ammunition. At the time of the murder, Lapt officers were required to use that ammunition even when carrying a personal weapon. The physical characteristics of the bullets and the crime scene evidence became part of the prosecution's case. The gun itself was never recovered. That was important. Investigators could not take Lazarus's gun, compare it to the bullets, and say that it was definitively the murder weapon. But there was another fact. Less than 2 weeks after Sherri was killed, Lazarus reported that her own .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver had been stolen. She told Santa Monica police that the gun had been taken from the glove compartment of her car while it was parked in Santa Monica. She later purchased another firearm. The timing became one of the prosecution's most important circumstantial arguments. The gun was gone. It had never been recovered, and the bullets found in Sherri's body were consistent with ammunition that lapped officers were required to use. But the defense challenged the firearms evidence. A defense firearms examiner testified that Smith & Wesson had manufactured hundreds of thousands of Model 49 revolvers. She also disputed the prosecution's characterization of the ammunition and questioned whether the crime scene evidence could establish the barrel length of the gun. The defense's point was simple. A gun that could have fired the ammunition was not necessarily the gun that fired it. There was another piece of evidence that complicated the picture. DNA was found beneath Sherri's fingernails. In later testing, experts identified mixtures involving DNA from multiple people. Some of the partial profiles were considered consistent with Lazarus. Other material came from people who could not be identified. And some of it did not belong to Sherri. But DNA under a victim's fingernails can raise questions without answering them. Was it deposited during a struggle? Was it old? Was it contamination? Was it related to the murder? The prosecution argued that the biological evidence supported its case. The defense challenged the significance of the testing and the methods used. The jury ultimately heard both sides. There was also a question that had been sitting in the case from the beginning. Why had Sherri's murder originally been treated as a burglary? The physical scene was not entirely consistent with a conventional burglary. There was no clear forced entry. Valuable property was left untouched. The stereo equipment had been moved, but it had not simply been stolen, and Sherri had suffered a brutal physical attack before being shot. There were signs of a struggle. The defense would later emphasize evidence suggesting that someone other than Lazarus might have been involved. A nearby woman, Evangelina Flores, testified that on the morning or early afternoon of February 24th, she heard sounds resembling two people fighting. She recalled hearing a slamming sound. Then she heard a car drive away. At the time, she told police the sounds occurred at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. The defense also introduced evidence that fingerprints recovered from the condominium could not be attributed to Lazarus, John, or Sherri. Some were found on the stereo equipment. That evidence did not identify a killer, but it allowed the defense to argue that the crime scene contained unexplained traces of other people. And then there was the issue of the original investigation itself. The defense argued that police had made serious mistakes in 1986. Within days or weeks of the murder, according to evidence presented later, John Ruetten had told investigators about Lazarus. Sherri's father had also told investigators that his daughter had been threatened by her husband's former girlfriend. Sherri's parents urged police to investigate Lazarus, but investigators focused on the burglary theory. A former LAPTA detective later provided an opinion that the original investigation had suffered from tunnel vision because detectives concentrated on unidentified burglars rather than exploring the possibility that an lapped officer was involved. The defense would use that history to argue that the long delay had damaged Lazarus's ability to defend herself. People had died. Memories had faded. Records had disappeared. Some evidence had been lost or destroyed. The original 911 recordings were no longer available. Gunshot residue evidence from Sherri's hands had also been lost. And the secretary who had witnessed the confrontation between Lazarus and Sherri had died. These were not imaginary problems. The appellate record acknowledged that some evidence that might have helped the defense was no longer available, but that did not mean the murder charge had to be dismissed. The trial court concluded that Lazarus had shown some prejudice from the delay, but that the prosecution had a strong justification for the eventual delay because the case depended on developing and matching DNA evidence. The appellate court later agreed that the delay did not violate her constitutional right to due process. The prosecution's case, however, was not simply about a woman who once loved a man. It was about a chain of circumstances. Lazarus had been involved with John Ruetten. John had chosen Sherri. Lazarus had reacted emotionally to the engagement. She had confronted Sherri at work. Sherri was murdered after marrying Ruetten. A bite mark on Sherri contained saliva from a woman. That DNA eventually matched Lazarus. Lazarus had owned a small, large .38 caliber revolver. The ammunition recovered from the scene was consistent with ammunition required for lapped officers. 2 weeks after the murder, Lazarus reported her revolver stolen, and the murder occurred on a day when Lazarus was off duty. None of these facts alone established the entire crime. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a coherent explanation. The defense offered another. Lazarus was a respected police officer. She had no history of violence. Friends and colleagues testified that they had never seen her behave violently. The defense challenged the prosecution's characterization of her relationship with Ruetten. It attacked the DNA evidence. It challenged the firearms evidence. It highlighted unidentified fingerprints. It pointed to the failures of the original investigation. And it questioned whether the evidence really established that Lazarus was the person who killed Sherri. Then came the interview that would become one of the strangest pieces of the case.
Already know it too.
Because I know how this stuff works, okay? Don't get me wrong, you're right, I have been doing this a long time. And now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me. Now I got that sense. I mean, we had a fight, and so I went and killed her. I mean, come on.
Do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed. If you're doing this as an interrogation, you're saying, hey, I'm a suspect. Well, now I got a problem with, so now, I mean, I
Detectives had questioned her about her relationship with John and her knowledge of Sherri. Lazarus initially appeared uncertain about details that investigators already knew. When asked about Ruetten, she repeated his name as though trying to remember who he was. She said they had gone to school together. She described him first as a close friend. Then she acknowledged that they had dated. When detectives asked about the end of the relationship, she said she had not considered him her boyfriend. When they asked about Sherri, Lazarus initially said she did not know whether she had met her. Then she acknowledged that she might have met her at a hospital. She said she might have spoken with her once or twice. When investigators asked whether she had ever gone to Sherri and confronted her, Lazarus eventually acknowledged that they might have had a conversation about John. When asked whether she had ever been in the condominium where John and Sherri lived, she initially said she did not know. Later, she said she might have known where they lived. The detectives continued asking about whether she had fought with Sherri. Lazarus said that if such a fight had happened, she did not remember it. Near the end of the interview, she expressed disbelief that anyone would think she had killed Sherri because of a fight.
It just doesn't sound familiar. I mean, what are they saying? So I fought with her, so now, I mean, they're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. I mean, come on. I mean, that's insane. Right. I mean, if you guys are claiming that I'm a suspect, then, I got a problem with, with that. Okay? So, if you're doing this as an interrogation, you're saying, hey, I'm a suspect. Well, now I got a problem with, now you're accusing me of this? Is that what you're saying?
That interview did not contain a confession. But the prosecution used Lazarus's changing answers to argue that she was minimizing her connection to Sherri and John. The defense had another interpretation. The relationship had happened more than 20 years earlier. Lazarus was being questioned about events from 1986, and memory after 2 decades is not the same thing as memory after 2 days. That distinction became part of the battle over the evidence. By the time the case went to trial, the prosecution had reconstructed a relationship that had existed before Sherri's death. But the central question remained the same. Could the evidence establish what happened inside the condominium? The trial began in 2012. The case had been unsolved for 26 years, and now the woman accused of killing Sherri was sitting in court as a former lap detective. One of the most important witnesses was John Ruetten. He had been Sherri's husband. He had been Lazarus's former romantic partner, and on the day of the murder, he was the person who came home and found Sherri dead. He testified about discovering his wife. He also had to revisit the relationship that prosecutors believed supplied the motive. The courtroom therefore contained a painful collision of 2 parts of his past: the woman he had once dated and the woman he had married. Only one of them was still alive. The prosecution described its evidence in unusually simple terms: a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. And the phrase captured the structure of the case. The DNA was the strongest physical connection. The bullets and firearm evidence supplied circumstantial support. The relationship history supplied the alleged motive. And the prosecution argued that the pieces were not independent coincidences. They formed a single explanation. But prosecutors still had to overcome the same problem that had confronted investigators in 1986. The murder weapon was missing. There was no confession. There was no eyewitness who testified that she saw Lazarus shoot Sherri. And the crime had happened so long ago that some potentially useful evidence was gone. The prosecution, therefore, had to convince 12 jurors that the surviving evidence was enough. The defense concentrated heavily on the DNA. The bite mark sample had been collected in 1986. Decades passed. The defense questioned how the evidence had been stored and handled. There had been concerns about the condition of the evidence container by the time it was located. The defense argued that those issues undermined confidence in the DNA evidence. The prosecution countered with the actual laboratory results. The first testing found the female major profile. The later testing of another swab independently matched Lazarus. The prosecution experts explained that the DNA profile from the bite corresponded to Lazarus. And that evidence was not merely based on a single modern test. Different examinations of the preserved material produced matching results. The defense also challenged the idea that the bite itself proved when or how it had occurred. But the pathologist had concluded that the injury was around the time of Sherri's death. That mattered because the DNA was not simply found somewhere in the home. It was associated with an injury on Sherri's body. The prosecution argued that the most reasonable explanation was that Lazarus had bitten Sherri during the struggle. The defense disputed the interpretation, but ultimately, the jury had to decide which explanation fit the evidence. The same was true of the gun. The prosecution could not produce the actual revolver. Instead, it presented evidence about the type of weapon capable of producing the physical characteristics found at the scene. Lazarus had owned a weapon of the relevant type. She reported it stolen less than 2 weeks after the murder. The defense argued that hundreds of thousands of similar revolvers existed. That was true, but the prosecution did not need to prove that Lazarus's gun was uniquely capable of firing the bullets. It needed to persuade jurors that the circumstances surrounding her gun were significant when considered with everything else. There was one more detail. Lazarus had been off duty on February 24, 1986. She had also been off duty for the 3 preceding days. There was no evidence that colleagues noticed injuries on her when she returned to work the next day. The defense could use that absence of observed injuries as another argument. If she had been involved in a violent struggle, where were the marks? But the prosecution did not have to prove that she had visible injuries. The victim had been attacked. That did not necessarily mean the attacker would be seriously injured. Again, the question was not whether one isolated fact proved guilt. It was whether all of the evidence, taken together, established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. 3 days later, the verdict came. Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder.
Guilty of the crime of murder of Sherri Rasmussen in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony.
The court imposed a sentence totaling 27 years to life. After 26 years of uncertainty, the legal system had reached a conclusion. Sherri Rasmussen had been murdered. Stephanie Lazarus had been convicted of killing her. But the case did not end with the verdict. Lazarus appealed. She argued, among other things, that the extraordinary delay between the murder and the prosecution had deprived her of a fair defense. She challenged the searches of her home and computers. She challenged the admission of her pre-arrest interview. She challenged DNA evidence obtained from material beneath Sherri's fingernails. And she argued that the defense should have been permitted to present more evidence concerning another burglary that occurred in the area 6 weeks after Sherri's murder. The California Court of Appeal considered those arguments. In 2015, it affirmed the conviction. The court found no prejudicial error. The California Supreme Court later denied review. Years later, Lazarus continued pursuing legal challenges. In 2023, the Ninth Circuit considered her federal habeas appeal and affirmed the district court's denial. The conviction therefore remained in place. There was also a civil case. Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, sued Lazarus for wrongful death. The civil litigation eventually produced a judgment in their favor. In 2018, a California appellate court affirmed the judgment, rejecting Lazarus's argument that the lawsuit had been filed prematurely. The court noted the extraordinary history of the case. Sherri had been killed in 1986, Lazarus was charged in 2009 and convicted in 2012. The Rasmussens were awarded $10 million, but perhaps the most striking part of the case is not the length of the sentence. It is the length of time that passed before the original theory was overturned. For years, investigators believed they were looking for burglars, yet inside the original evidence was a clue that did not fit neatly into that theory. A bite mark, a tiny sample, saliva, DNA. The technology needed to understand that evidence did not exist in the form investigators eventually used in 1986. So the evidence waited. The case waited. Sherri's family waited. And the woman whose DNA was eventually found in that sample continued working as a police officer. That does not mean the original investigators had no evidence. They had a crime scene. They had physical injuries. They had fingerprints. They had witness information. They had a missing vehicle. They had the history surrounding Sherri's marriage, but they interpreted those facts through the burglary theory. And once that theory took hold, the investigation followed it. That is one of the clearest lessons of the Rasmussen case. Evidence does not speak for itself. Investigators have to decide what the evidence means. And once they decide what kind of crime they are looking at, every new piece of information can be interpreted through that framework. In 1986, the question was essentially, who were the burglars? Decades later, the question became, why was a woman's DNA on Sherri's arm? That second question led investigators to someone the first investigation had not successfully pursued. There are still aspects of the case that cannot be answered with absolute certainty. The murder weapon was never recovered. The original investigation lost or destroyed some evidence. Some witnesses were no longer available by the time the case went to trial. And because the crime occurred more than 2 decades before Lazarus was arrested, the courtroom could never reconstruct every minute of February 24, 1986. The jury therefore did not receive a perfect time machine. It received the evidence that had survived. The DNA, the forensic findings, the relationship history, the firearm evidence, the circumstances surrounding Lazarus's reported missing gun, the statements of witnesses, the records from the original investigation, and the competing interpretations offered by the prosecution and defense. The jury chose the prosecution's explanation. The appellate courts found no reversible error, and Stephanie Lazarus remains convicted of Sherri Rasmussen's murder. For Sherri's parents, the decades before the arrest had been defined by uncertainty. They knew their daughter had been killed. They knew the original investigation had focused on burglary. But they also believed there was another possibility. They had wanted investigators to examine their daughter's husband's former girlfriend. For years, there was no arrest, no trial, no verdict. Only a case number and a daughter who was never coming home. Then, a piece of evidence collected from Sherri's body in 1986 was tested with technology that did not exist when she was murdered. The result did not identify a stranger. It pointed toward a woman who had been part of the story from the beginning, and that is what makes the Rasmussen case so unusual. The killer, according to the conviction, was not discovered because investigators found a brand new clue at the crime scene. They found her because an old clue was finally understood. The evidence had been there. It had simply been waiting for the technology, the investigation, and the right question to meet. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old when she died. Her marriage had lasted only a few months. Her murder remained unsolved for 23 years. And for more than 2 decades, the person eventually convicted of killing her continued to live outside the case. Until one preserved swab changed the question. And once that question changed, the entire investigation had to be seen differently. If you want more deeply researched true crime documentaries, subscribe to The Final Clue,